On this episode of The Scorekeepers, join me, Daniel Farrell, as I sit down with composer Thomas Wilson to discuss his work on his doctoral dissertation during the pandemic, his efforts in teaching video game scoring and sound, and his work collaborating virtually to premiere a brand new cello concerto. Welcome to The Scorekeepers. Welcome to the show, Thomas.
Hi, so happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Daniel.
Before we get started, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Totally. Well, as of 2 days ago, I am now Dr. Thomas Wilson, successfully passed my defense here at Louisiana State University. I got my major in music composition. My minor is in experimental music and digital media. Fancy way of saying music technology, everyone has something a little different. And I do music for stage. I do music for, classical music, I guess, a bunch of different kind of web words there. But I also do music for video games. So part of that and part of my studies has led me to teaching at Louisiana Tech University. I'm an adjunct instructor of music theory there. So I teach music theory, and I debuted for the first time ever this class has been taught at Louisiana Tech. I taught music and sound for video games. So it was
That's
really
pretty cool.
They have a brand new game design minor. It was great to be able to get in on the ground floors and, teach people with absolutely zero music experience, but then also teach their industry studies students who were interested in doing music for games as well.
That's pretty impressive. I feel like a lot more universities are starting to kind of get turned on to video game music. And it wasn't, I remember my last year of NYU, I think it's 2 years ago. It was only then that they actually introduced like a scoring for video games class.
Yeah.
Before that, it was just you had to go and take like in the music technology course, like audio for game design, but it wasn't focused on music. It was audio and audio implementation.
Right.
So, that's really cool that you started that class over there, like specifically on music and audio,
Yeah, totally. It was kind of wild because I had to push the music students to learn audio techniques, and I had to push the people who had none of that to learn all of it. But then the implementation phase is the sort of audio middleware that you use to implement in games became a lot more naturally to the people who do all sorts of programs. And
yeah, that's the area of video game music where I know how those things function, and I've seen people use
Right.
it, but I've never really sat down and done it, and it's just like very intimidating.
Right. And the integration itself can be very troubleshooting heavy. So you need to be friends with your coders and be able to make sure that it
Right.
works in your specific build, and then don't update anything until you're done with the project.
So yeah, like quite impressive resume. What got you started in music? What kind of got the ball rolling for that whole long career you've had so far?
Well, totally. I guess honestly, I grew up in a musical family, but definitely not a traditional musical family. I grew up in a church that had congregational singing, so we would sing twice on Sundays and on Wednesday night, singing 4-part harmonies of hymns. There was no accompanying piano or anything. It was literally just singing. So you got to learn by ear, and a lot of the people memorized the tunes and everything, and they memorized the individual parts. And specifically at our church, we had 4-part singing, and so like people would memorize the tenor and bass. Sometimes people just sing the the melody or something. So that was how I just kind of existed for a long time. And it wasn't until we got from one of the members of the church a hand-me-down piano. They were getting rid of it. Their kids had carved tic-tac-toe into the piano. It was an upright piano. I was like, all right, we'll get this. And I got that and started teaching myself piano when I was in 7th grade. Then moved into band quickly thereafter, but I taught myself how to read sheet music, and I kind of joined band a little late. And then finally, somewhere through high school, it's like, okay, I love video game music. I'm going to start heading for that. And one of the things that had gotten me into sheet music and learning to read music specifically was video game music. I did arranging for a site called Ninsheet Music, nintendosheetmusic.org, I think it is. They changed their names a couple times. But that's where I started like arranging and starting getting my hands just a little wet in the composition. And then the rest is sort of history. Went on to get my bachelor's and master's in music composition at the University of Alabama, and then wrapped up at LSU. Or almost wrapped up. I still have to submit that document, but soon.
Nice. I mean, I feel like a lot of your music has that that sound of video games, that kind of classic sound.
Mm-hmm.
I remember at AMF that fighting the mischievous imp piece that you have for the Perot ensemble, and that was so video game inspired. And obviously that's how you got in, and it's kind of kept with you. I'm curious, like, what is the game score that kind of got you interested in the video game music?
Yeah, I mean, it was probably Spyro and Crash Bandicoot was the first time I was like, "Oh, this bops," like, it's like, "Is it good?" But it wasn't until, like, The Craft of Koji Kondo with, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. I played those. Without them, I wasn't super past the time of those. I think 2001, 2002 was the first time I played both of those, and I was like, "Oh, okay, you can do incredible things with games and music." So playing the ocarina, both of those, and having it mean something, having to hit the right notes and memorizing a tune, and you didn't have to exactly memorize the tune. And then, of course, the sort of adaptive elements within those two games stood out more to me than in Spyro and Crash. But I played Spyro and Crash first, so like those bops still are with me to this day. Yeah, and then quickly in high school, I got into Final Fantasy and Nobuo Uematsu scores and just the sort of craftsmanship that those have and themes of return and these little motivic ideas. Yeah, all of that really introduced me. I was introduced to music that way. Those are probably my biggest inspirations.
Yeah, I remember I did an interview with a couple people that I know that are composers for video games, and it is very cool to see how many people that, like you said, their first experience kind of with music, with orchestral music, is from video games, and seeing now sort of more of an effort being made to put that music into concert halls is just so great. So you as a composer, or you as an audio tech, with games and with composing, can you walk us through your crazy process for all that? Is it different for each kind of, when you're different projects, if you're doing concert or video game? Just give us an overview of that whole shebang.
Totally. I mean, they start from the same place, and it's one of two places. I either improvise at the piano here next to me, or I improvise in the shower. And it doesn't matter whether it's if it's a video game project I'm working on, if I'm working on a concert piece, or I'm working on a commission, if I'm working on a project that has to be turned in 3 days, all of those start from like the same sort of inspiration of improvisation. So I am a big fan of having people record the improvisations, and I was taught that very early on, fortunately, and that allows me to get some gesturation of ideas, some material to begin. And then that sort of changes which path it goes on, right? So if I'm working on games, I generally go straight to the DAW with my recordings and start picking out things, and then start recreating and then adding on, experimenting there. And then if I'm working on something more classical oriented, maybe something that's just straight sheet music, I would go from that and go to a notation software and start messing around in there. So I think there's and of course, the electroacoustic thing is a whole nother animal where you might start, going straight to max and start messing around with different parameters in there. So but all of them really start at the same place. They start from a place of memory and identity. And that's something that's really strong in my music, is these themes, these whether even and in my most recent piece that we'll talk about, I'm sure soon, just these timbral identities that are very strong. And
is that something that you kind of go to first? Is themes, is melodies, or I know you just said timbres? Do you have like a go-to kind of first element, or is it different for every project?
It's totally different. It's just that identity, right? What is the identity of this going to be? Is it going to be a timbral? Is it an atmospheric piece? Is it this needs a theme in order to move forward? It really just depends on the piece. I generally kind of have a hard time coming up with the themes, so those take a little bit longer, I think, than these sort of ideas behind the themes. And then another part of the process, especially when I'm working on game music, is to plaster as much art around me, as much concept art or animations, as much as I can, and immerse myself into that world.
Right, because
When you
I don't think a lot of people realize that, for film music, when you're composing for film, you normally have the picture in front of you. But for video game music, it's pretty rare that you have a build of the game that you're seeing. A lot of the time you're scoring to just concept art, or a brief sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah. So getting as much as you can to really get into that world and create something that's just unique and special. It helps. It helps when you have that concept art.
Congrats recently on your dissertation defense. That's crazy. I can't ever imagine doing anything like that. I stopped at the master's. The doctoral dissertations that I've seen from various people are just insane for music. Can you maybe talk to the audience about your project?
Absolutely. I would want to start off with, about a year ago, I had no idea what this project was going to be. So a year to do a dissertation, maybe not so uncommon in art fields, but a little bit less common in other fields. But either way, I had no idea. I was like, okay, this pandemic is starting. What am I going to do? And it literally didn't change until July. I met with a performer and great friend of mine, Edward Turegilov. And Edward, we were meeting to discuss a work we were both working on called Duality for cello and loop pedal. And we were working on that during the pandemic. We're like, okay, the pandemic's hitting. This is a solo piece. He can perform it. I'm not worried about performance avenues or recordings or whatever. He's going to be able to do this by himself. It's great. We were meeting, and then he said, hey, would you like to write a concerto for me? And commission me right then as we were working on this other piece. I'm like, oh, that's great. That'll be my defense. That'll be my dissertation. This is what I'm all going to write about. And then I added, kind of somewhat naively at the time, I was like, oh, I'll write it for this flex ensemble. This new thing that's going on during the pandemic, right? This sort of adaptive ensemble, these sort of pieces that come together where it doesn't matter who shows up to play as much, right? You're the focus is to have a performance of the piece. So I said, okay, a concerto guarantees that he will be able to play it and he could tour this around. It would lead to more performance opportunities after the pandemic as well. So that's where I started off initially. So started off, all right, I'm going to write a concerto for cello and flex ensemble. But what I started also was happening over the summer was all the live performances were being canceled.
Right.
The pandemic happening, I struggled with it for a bit and said maybe I need to delay this entire dissertation for a year. What's the point of to me at least, what's the point of writing something if it's not going to be performed? And it's like it's not my MO. So I said, okay, I'll just take a break. And then one of the things I was keeping tabs on, though, was the Creative Repertoire Initiative, probably something that you have heard about and had experience with other people. That was an initiative started near the beginning in April of the pandemic by a number of composers and band conductor directors. Trying to figure out how do we define what is music that can be performed during the pandemic? How do we come up with terminology? How do we pass this on to composers so composers can still work and maybe make some music sales and maybe have a few performances while all of the craziness is going on? So I saw that developing. I joined the Facebook group rather early on in May when it was first started, the CRI Facebook group, and followed it all summer. And then once he asked me to write a concerto, I said, that's the one, that's the thing. And I'm going to write about this thing that's never happened before, right? We've had pandemics, but this whole idea that maybe we can make music during a pandemic with the video recording technology is the last major pandemic in the States, at least. None of that was happening. So I thought, okay, let's make the most out of the worst situation and dive in and examine the Creative Repertoire Initiative and write a concerto while I'm at it. And that was my dissertation, my big projects.
That is a insane project to try to dive into in the midst of the craziness that was 2020.
Yeah. And it was terrible. Part of the project was interviews. I was interviewing composers and conductors and performers and was like, hey, how's the pandemic for you? Kind of like how you're doing right now. And they're like, oh yeah, it sucks. So like a lot of it was like a lot of depressing things to come to terms with. It's like, I'm happily will share you my revenue streams from last year and this year. And it's like, that's the worst, like, and this is people's livelihoods. This is how people are able to put food on the table, and to see it just disappear just like that. So it was a really stressful thing. And it was also a new thing, right? So there's not a lot of research necessarily done on it. I'm sure there will be after this year and things get published. My dissertation gets finished and uploaded and published. And so there will be some research out there eventually, but right, it's such a new thing that it's not much that you can pull from.
So you had a portion of your dissertation that was like a research on current composers and performance problems in the pandemic, and then the other half was this concerto. Did one kind of influence the other?
They kind of went together, I think. Yeah. So, I mean, some would influence one and some would influence the other. So, part of my research, I did analyses on a few pieces, some cellular pieces. I didn't end up writing a cellular work. I thought it'd be a really cool idea to do a cellular concerto. I thought that might be a very interesting sort of avenue to explore. But I ended up writing on cellular pieces, or mostly cellular works and how they were constructed, because if there is a history to this sort of music, that's generally where that came from, is these cellular works of Terry Riley, Julius Eastman, some well-known early minimalists but also cellular composers. And then I also looked at Alex Shapiro's Passages, a newly cellular work that's an electroacoustic work that's 3 minutes in length. So there's a tape track that keeps everything together, and the cells, people can perform any cell that they want as long as the rules and parameters are followed. So the analyses that came a little bit early on, I dove into those works, and that kind of influenced me right away. It was like, okay, I have a little bit something different. I have the cello, who's going to be a steady presence throughout all of this. I'll just use the cello to gesturate and create a lot of the ideas that will be passed back to the ensemble. And I'll use that as my glue, because I know my cellist friend. I know he's going to perform this later. I know that he'll be able to. Then also you have someone who can, play the same concerto over and over again, right? And knows the work. So he can play it with whatever group he wants. And that was another thing that sort of influenced that, and it's sort of like pretty explicitly informed some of the writing decisions I did. I was like, okay, so I know what he can do. I'm going to make sure this is playable and rehearsable and everything, because of those situations, for sure.
So, what was the instrumentation that you wrote for the Flex Ensemble, or how did you kind of decide what the parts are and how you're going to divvy it up and how you're going to make it flexible?
For sure. It starts with the cello. So there's so many cello concertos out there. Initially, from July to October, I listened to a cello concerto every day. Some of them that people say are great, they're actually great, and some of them that people say are duds. I'm like, wait a second. So I grabbed all sorts of just sort of how to write for cello, and a lot of it, because the cello is such a common concerto to write for. I mean, it's one of the ones that a lot of composers try to do because it's I don't know, people love a cello concerto. I don't know. So a lot of that, I realized that the cello can really sound and sing throughout almost any register. Like some of them more than others, of course. The lower one can get muddy, but generally the cello can project, right? So I decided that I would base each of the movements around register and range. So I then, when I was looking at the flex ensemble, it's not a full flex piece. It's not a piece where tuba can play the highest line. It's instead separated by registers, so it's just a regular flex ensemble piece. I don't know. There's like six performers possible per part, I believe. Maybe it's five. Yeah, it's 5 performers possible per part, and each of those are divvied up by registers. So a wind band could play it, a wind ensemble, a concert band, an orchestra could play it, a saxophone quartet, if there's an extra alto and an extra tenor, could play it, I believe. So I tried to keep in mind all of the different sort of standard chamber ensembles as well who could play the work. And of course, part of this is that a cellist and a pianist could play this, so it could shrink all the way down to just like more like a sonata or something, you know. So it could flex up really big and it could shrink down really low. And so being really careful about register and timbre was the way I sort of was able to make that possible. There's also a few more cadenzas than I probably would have liked. The concerto is kind of a dying art form a little bit. It's like it's definitely in the sort of ivory castles of classical music too, right? It's like its own unique thing. And I said, okay, how am I going to be different? I was like, I'm not going to write any cadenzas. And it's like, well, it turns out you probably need to write some cadenzas if you're working for Flex Ensemble to make sure certain things are heard and spoken and remembered.
Did you write out the cadenzas, or did you? Because I know, like in the true classical sense, like performers would improvise that, but that practice has kind of been lost. But did you write out specifically what you wanted?
Yes. The only thing that I didn't write that ended up in the final recording was something he showed me the day of. So the whole time though, I was collaborating with Edward. So every single time I send him the first draft of a movement in November. And then it was a movement each month after that, November, December, and January. He had a draft of a different movement, of a 3 movement thing. And it's like, okay, what is playable? What's performable? What speaks? What intonation should we change? Or what's just like some notes that don't work? So some quadruple stops that I wrote, and like, I'm not a string player, or at least definitely not a bowed string player. So some things that I work out in a textbook and it seems like it would work, doesn't necessarily translate to the most playable. And so if I can change a pitch here or there and make it easier, while also having the same intent and idea behind it, that's fine by me. So a lot of that, because we collaborated for the last project and we collaborated for this project, we've been collaborating for over a year now. So we were very comfortable in like making those adjustments.
What's that process like, collaborating with him to see, is he collaborating in a sense like very early on with ideas, or is it more of, can you test this, try this, and how was it collaborating in the pandemic with, Zoom and stuff?
Yeah, totally. It was wild to say the least. So a part of that being from game world a little bit, video games, is like you learn to communicate and figure out what people are looking for. So I was like, I sat down with him, and almost all of my collaborations are like this. I asked, "What kind of piece do you want?" And normally performers are like taken back because that's not a very classical sort of, I don't know, it's not a very art form thing to do. The performer, quote unquote, serves the wishes of the composer or something really nasty. I don't know. But like I don't think that. It's like, what piece would you like to play? And I can work within whatever mediums that you're looking for. So I asked him, what piece would you like to play? And he said, I don't care. You do what you want. So no ideas, no concept art. I had to come up with everything. So yeah, he stayed very much out of the idea stage of it, and I think probably a little bit of that, like a little bit of no, I want to stay out of the ideas stage, and he was much more hands-on in the practical. Once I sent a part to him, he was much more practical, including some phrase shapes. Let's extend this phrase a little bit, let's trim this one back, things that he thought would move the piece forward and backwards. Very comfortable with that. But that wasn't until I sent him a draft did he really comment on any of the specific movements. And yeah, working over Zoom and everything, it was pretty wild to say the least, because you lose all sorts of the overtones and everything, and so you're just hoping that you hear the full and lushness that he says. All right, yeah, this is a pretty nice part, and you're like, okay, I hope so. I'm losing it. So yeah, so there was a lot of that, and then also one of the techniques I use is that we worked back and forth. This one probably was the most discussion out of any specific part of the concerto, was a knocking that I wanted to have happened. I wanted to have 3 knocks on the cello. I was like, oh, can we knock on the side of the cello and leave one string resonant? I was like, that's a pretty cool effect. I've heard that before. And it just wasn't working right. And I couldn't tell if it was Zoom or just like the performer didn't want to knock. Knocking on the side means that you had to put your bow down and then knock. And he's comfortable knocking on the cello. He had a cello built for knocking on, right? So it's not like anything like that was offensive. It just wasn't producing the sound that either he or I wanted. So instead we made it more dramatic. So he mutes all the strings, puts the bow down, and then slaps the back of the cello 3 times as a sort of a warning, a sort of knocking effect. And so that like took about a month to sort of settle on, because every time we would meet, it's Zoom stuff, and people get Zoom fatigue. So you can't meet on Zoom every day. If we were on campus, we would just, have lunch and go after lunch to check something out, So I think the collaboration took a little longer, and it definitely felt like it took longer to get feedback, and not because he is not say anything about him. He provides great feedback and timely feedback and everything, but it's just this sort of, all right, we're going to set up a Zoom meeting. When are you free? Okay, you'll be this day. Right. Okay. Right.
It does wear on you after a while.
For sure. And we're both instructors and teachers, so we have students and studios and all that to coordinate. Busy folks, busy life, which is, for the conversations that probably take 2 minutes, like, oh, I tried this thing, boom, it works okay. Every now and then I got a voice recording memo, and he would say, I tried this thing. And so those were a little bit more productive, but we didn't realize it until later on. The same thing that I used to compose was what we should have been using to rehearse a little bit more during the pandemic, but it's all right.
So talking about, flex music, I was speaking with a composer, Josh, trying to do He's actually going to be on another episode of this. And, he's a big band composer, band composer, not a big band composer. But he, much like yourself, kind of started really exploring flex music in the pandemic. And I feel like that whole field has kind of exploded because of the pandemic. And, I've really seen it grow in popularity in pedagogical circles, with teaching and especially band music. Do you see perhaps a more mainstream adoption of flex music and flex ensembles in the greater classical realm?
Yeah, great question. I don't really know what's going to happen in the classical realm. I do what I do and we see what happens, right? I think the classical realm wants to get back to classical music. Fortunately, there's been some programming changes in the past year with a couple times off, more time to reflect and think and on current events. But I'm not sure, I don't know. What I do know is that Edward wants to continue performing the piece. So the Flex Ensemble will at least live on for this. He has a group called Tampa Homegrown that he wants to have. It's a completely different set of players than the premiere recording. He says, all right, we're going to rehearse this and get it together. That's going to happen in September. And then I know we're going to have at least a piano performance of it. And then I'm trying to get a band performance as well. So I don't know if it's going to last much longer. I don't really
good
know.
For
but
you
I
for
do
like call for scores. You just submit it to anything.
That's right. It's like it works. It works. It has everything. I'm going to, if I had to guess, though, if you like held a knife to me or something, like, you got to guess what the future of music is. I'm going to think that it is going to fade. I think there's going to be some waning. And I think that's really unfortunate because there is a need for it in certain areas, especially in band music, like you said. When I was in the first band program I was in was 20 people or so. And bear in mind, I didn't grow up in a big city, but I grew up in a city. So small band programs we tend to think of as like rural, like, oh, they don't have much money. But if you go, rural is different for different places. Rural Georgia bands are huge with like 300 people. Same thing in Texas, right? When you have one county, one school. So I think it's unfortunate because band programs like those need flex music. They just do. And if what people didn't realize was that they already were flex music. They were just leaving out parts, right? It's like, oh, we're going to do this piece and this one kind of doubles this other one. So we're just going to drop it. And that, of course, as a composer, it can ruin your vision if you don't hear enough of that middle melody when it comes in, or the too much of the top themes, or too much trills here, or whatever. And so like these works were already existing before the pandemic, and I think will continue after the pandemic. But I hope composers continue to write for these ensembles, and I think there's a lot, selfishly, but I think there's a lot of money there as well for people who want, for the lower grade band music who like is more flexible and not as standard. I think there's a lot to be spent there because they're what they're used to right now is already like half that, but it's sort of embracing the flex.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was in middle school, we did not have a big band program, and every year the ensemble's different, completely different rosters,
totally.
And so like you said, programming is just so challenging. So I agree. Like flex music definitely needs to stick around there, if not grow more. And I hope more composers. I have yet to write a flex piece, but now I'm like edging to write a flex piece. I really want to write a flex piece.
Omar Thomas, he's a composer of band music. He said writing for flex is like taking a big sheet of paper, your grand masterpiece, and writing it with 3 crayons. So there is a lot. There's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I've seen incredible crayon work, so you can still do it. But there's a lot of that you sacrifice when you write for flex, and I think you need to have the composers be willing to give that up.
Right.
And So some composers will, and some composers won't, and we'll just see what happens.
For your piece, do you feel like the overall piece is going to change a lot depending on the ensemble that performs it? Orchestra versus a saxophone quintet or whatever. Is it? Do you see the piece changing a lot, like the way it's performed or the way the audience receives it?
So the emotive text I used a lot of that to try to get. I was worried about it, like, oh, this is gonna sound completely different on the thing. It's like a genuine concern, especially when you're writing a concerto, right? You think, okay, the backing does matter, whether it's you can't just throw an organ next to a drum kit next to a string quartet and expect all of that to balance and
I
blend.
kind of want to see that now.
It would be pretty wild. I kind of want to write that too. An electric guitar, why don't we throw one of those in? And yeah, I think that you give up that control a little bit and you just trust the performers, right? If it was an orchestra playing with the cello, I think that they're going to play like an orchestra and support the cello, right? I don't think they're going to blare at everything that they can and overpower. And same thing, if it's a string quartet, I think the cellist of the string quartet or quintet really, might not compete as much, right? So I think, trusting performers to do the right thing is generally a winning bet, So I think that even if the timbres will change, the sound will change, I think the glue of having the cello stay the same will let the piece function and be audible and discernible and all that sort of things that we try to do when we write music. But I'm not worried about it necessarily in different environments. It'll just be different, and that's the piece. The piece is designed to be different.
That's awesome. Well, what would be your ideal, maybe not ideal, but like what would be the coolest ensemble to perform it?
Oh man.
Besides our organ string quartet electric guitar combo.
That's true. That's a good one. I'd love to hear it with a sax quartet and a quintet plus, I think that could be really cool. I also have it set for percussion ensemble, and I think that could be
That
a
would be
really
really
interesting,
cool, I think.
because it's a lot of auxiliary. It's a lot of, I'm very open on any of the keyboard instruments, so there could be all sorts of interpretations on how those are to be bowed and struck, and I think that could be a really interesting contrast, because there's some moments of sustain where I can imagine a rolled marimba or a bowed vibraphone, both of them doing pretty effective, or even just like a pedal vibe, creating some really incredible timbres and sound, or maybe even a steel drum, that would also be a really cool timbre to explore. So I think, percussion ensemble or a saxophone group would be really interesting to hear with both of those. It kind of fits the work a little bit.
That's awesome. There's a particular area of the piece you want to talk about a little bit more, or another project you might have in the pipeline?
Not sure if I ever said it, but this is the Rougarou Concerto. I titled it. It's based on a Cajun folklore legend known as the Rougarou. And the Rougarou, you can think of it pretty succinctly as a swamp werewolf. This was before it is pretty wild. It's before the U.S. was established. Even the Acadian settlers in Louisiana, that was the excuse to tell kids not to go out at night near the swamps. The loup-garou will get them when, in actuality, there's crocodiles and all sorts of dangerous critters down here to not mess with. Of course, the Rougarou was also blamed on for mysterious disappearances of adults and people missing meetings. They were like, "Oh no, I changed into the Rougarou." So I thought it was fitting, that sort of narrative of not going outside at night to be is a little on the nose, but there's a lot of connection with that in the pandemic, right? Don't go outside. Here's the reasons why. And I think that there's I think that there was a lot going on at the time to like justify those sort of anxieties, like you really will, if you go outside, you could literally perish, and so having that fear a little bit while writing the piece, I definitely built into the work. And Edward, working with him and collaborating with him in the past, is a very aggressive cello player, right? And like maybe that's not there's aggressive cello players out there, but maybe not the first two that you put together, right? He was a vocalist in a metal band, and I was like, okay, so I'm gonna go into this like hard rock, hard metal, and this very aggressive sound depicting the Rougarou itself. And then the second movement, so the first and third movements are that, and then the second movement is a contrasting, like very soliloquy, singing singing part that he has, and kind of contrasts between the other two. So there's 3 movements, about 20 minutes, give or take a minute or two, depending on how the cadenzas are performed. So I'll say that about the piece. And then the next steps, we're moving. We like literally right after this, I'm probably going to sign a lease for a place.
Oh, nice.
We're moving up to North Louisiana, where I'll be closer for commute to where I work. And then my partner got a job as well. So we'll be moving up there. But more importantly, I'm so excited to get back to writing music. It's been a while, and I'm not the revision process is important, and it is writing music, and it is making adjustments and all that. But I'm ready to get those new ideas again. So I have a few commissions lined up. I have a commission for a traverso flute, which is a Baroque flute. And it has, I've been definitely touring around with more just intonation concepts in duality. That was something I did where the cellist, he would play A440, which is the A string on the cello at different points, and the electronic background for all different intonations. So it was very easy for him to perform the different intonations, things that were happening, but swirled there. So the traverso flute is tuned, I believe hers is in D major, right? So there's all sorts of things that, okay, so there's going to be some intervals that, sound more close to equal temperament, and there's going to be some wonky ones. So I can't wait to jump in and explore that.
That's really definitely interesting.
It's an instrument that's been more explored in the last 20 years, and like of course modern people are like, oh yeah, just intonation is cool now. It's like, hey, let's get outside of equal temperament, down with equal temperament. And so I'm excited for that. And then also I'm writing for the Vermilion duet a flute and clarinet duo. So I don't know what that piece will be, but that one I have a little bit more time on. I'm going to get the traverso flute.
Wow, busy. I can't wait to hear some of this stuff. This sounds awesome.
Oh, thank you. Yes, my recital is coming up, or at least right now it's coming up. I don't know when this.
Yeah, I don't know when these will get out.
It'll be July 17th. So I don't know, it's pretty quick. It's also quick for me because I got to get that figured out. So it'll be July 17th. I'll have the concerto out, but probably for sure by the time that you're hearing this, the video will be available as well.
Cool, yeah, and I will definitely, and links to your site and anywhere else that you have your music, audience will be able to find it and take a listen, because some of this is really, really cool.
Awesome.
Thanks, Daniel. All of it is really, really cool.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's wild. It ended up being more like a Perot ensemble on the premiere because of the instruments that we had. It was like, oh, let's add a bassoon, let's add a double bass, let's take away this, let's add this. It was really close to sort of Perot ensemble. So it's kind of interesting that we met, with a Perot piece. And to me, at least on this premiere recording, it'll be like talking about another Perot piece. Nice. Except there's a soloist, the cello. So yeah,
cool, awesome. Well, it's been great speaking with you and hearing about your music and your updates, and this dissertation, which is totally fascinating. Do you have any social media that you want the audience to follow, or just go to your website?
Yeah, you can find everything on my website, thomaslwilson.com. I have links to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Not TikTok. I do have a TikTok. I'm about to get that going, and they're going to do some stuff, and it won't be anything like my other curated content. I do some fun hobbies on the side that'll be great for TikTok.
Cool. Well, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Daniel. I had a great time.
It was great hearing from Thomas about his latest projects. To hear more, be sure to check out his social media and his website in the links below. Thanks again for listening to The Scorekeepers. Please rate and review us, as that really helps us to beat the algorithm overlords and get new listeners to find our show. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out our previous episodes in both Season 1 and 2, available wherever you listen. And if you haven't already, check out the second episode of Season 2, where I sat down with songwriters and performers Connor Stewart and Megan De La Torre as we discussed their latest collaboration. All of the links mentioned in this episode can be found in the description of this episode and on danielfarrell.com/scorekeepers. Thanks for listening. See you next time.